welcome to this live webcast directly from the Bloomberg School of Public Health at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore. Today we will have, I presume, a very interesting conversation about the Clean Air Act as a model policy with first of all, our major guest, Congressman Henry Waxman. Congressman Waxman is one of the most accomplished legislators in the history of the U.S. Congress. Waxman has represented California, the 33rd District for 40 years. His tenacious guardianship, oversight, and amendments to the Clean Air Act improved the quality of the air we breathe, made our water cleaner and safer to drink, helped preserve the ozone layer, decreased acid rain, impacted our food systems, and saved countless lives. His contribution to EPA regulations resonate today in the CO2 or greenhouse gases protections he envisioned and championed years ago. Welcome, Congressman Waxman.
Thank you very much.
And we are also joined by Greg Dodson, who's the Vice President for Energy Policy at American Progress. His work focuses on finding solutions to the nation's energy and environmental challenges. For more than 18 years, Greg was the lead environmental and energy staffer for Representative Henry Waxman and the top staffer on the House Energy and Commerce Committee and the House Committee on Oversight and Government Reform. His major accomplishments include House passage of comprehensive change on climate and the enactments of law on clean energy, pesticide safety, drinking water, and clean air. So welcome, gentlemen. When I was preparing for this conversation, I came upon a piece in the National Review about the CAA, and a piece signed by Orrin Cass. You may remember he was the domestic policy advisor for Mitt Romney's campaign, so he cannot be suspected of being biased, at least in favor of your own political position. But it's very interesting because I'm quoting directly from the paper he signed in the National Review last March. In practice, the CAA has been quite effective. Between 1980 and 2013, lead levels in the air fell 92%, carbon monoxide fell 84%, sulfur dioxide fell 81%, nitrogen dioxide fell 60%, and ozone fell 33%. These are significant achievements, and environmentalists are justifiably proud of the enormous public health benefits that have followed. This is stunning in a way, and so what's the story? How did we came to these results?
The Clean Air Act, both in 1970 when it was first adopted into law, and then in 1990, which was the last time it was revised, had very strong bipartisan support. It was signed originally by President Nixon, and that same year in 1970, he created the Environmental Protection Agency. In 1990, the president that signed the bill that made it into law was President George H.W. Bush. Now, it belies the conflict politically to get the law passed. It wasn't so easy because it took us a long time to finally get the consensus behind the 1990 revisions, which strengthened the law in the areas where it tried to deal with the smog and the pollution in the urban areas and to protect the unpolluted areas of the country from becoming polluted. It was strengthened by the time we passed the last revisions to deal with acid rain, toxic air pollutants, the deterioration of the upper ozone layer. Each one of those provisions and the whole act itself succeeded over people who said, we don't think there's a problem, we don't need such a strong law, we don't want government regulation. And we had industries, and I still have the records of what they said at the hearings, that if we pass these provisions that turned out to be passed, we'll have a depression. The auto industry will have to close down. Energy in this country will be unaffordable, and all these dire predictions of extremely high costs. Once the law, however, was adopted, it didn't do anything harmful. It did a lot of good, and didn't cost nearly a fraction of what some of the industry people testify that it would cost if we move down in this direction.
I'm interested to better understand, and I think it's important for our audience, why there was those two major windows of opportunity in 1970 and 1990. Why was it possible to do this, such a bold legislation at the time?
On the 1970, I wasn't in Congress at the time, but I think that there was a real push for having a federal law that would work with the states, give the states the power to implement the law to achieve health-based standards so that the different pollutants didn't exceed what would be healthy to breathe. If it exceeded the levels of what was healthy, then we'd have a society where those who were most vulnerable to those pollutants couldn't live in the same place with everybody else. And of course, the most vulnerable were the children and the elderly. Well, we didn't want a society where we all couldn't continue to live together. And we wanted a federal requirement that everywhere in the country they had to achieve the health standards. And once you achieve the health standards, or if you were achieving it because you didn't have a lot of industry polluting the air or a lot of automobiles polluting the air, we wanted to make sure that the air was protected and not used up. This is like people think of a development of a neighborhood. If it's open area, you could say, well, there's a lot of room to build. But if you just let everybody come in and build, before you know it, you won't have any open space any longer. I think we need to think about air pollution the same way. If we let everybody pollute, after a while, there will be no air healthy enough for people who live in that area to breathe. And that was the basis of the law originally and always to this day, that we wanted to regulate the use of the air so that it's going to protect the public health.
Greg, what is your sense of the story? What explained the window of opportunity for change? And
both the 1970 law and the 1990 law predated my time in Congress, but I think that you get these moments every 15 years or so where the politics align, where you have members in Congress who care passionately about it. They've been waiting, they've been working on it, and then you get a receptive administration, executive branch, and then together with public opinion, the moment crystallizes and you have an opportunity. And those periods don't happen in every Congress. It came very close in 2009, when I was on the Hill, and we had, as you recall, in 2008, we had both candidates for both presidential parties, or both political parties, campaigning on the need to address climate change. And so we thought we were going to be able to do a major revision of the Clean Air Act and strengthen it, and we came very close. But I think you
But it wasn't bipartisan.
But it wasn't bipartisan.
Even though we had the two representative leaders of the two major parties advocating for pretty much the same policy.
That's right.
And then the Republican, who was John McCain, turned against it. He didn't win the presidency, but then he joined the other Republicans and said, "Oh, no, we don't need this law."
That's right. You began by listing some impressive statistics about air pollution reductions. And there's one that I would add to that, which is, since 1990, we've reduced air pollution by more than 40%, but the GDP has grown by over 60%. So we've really demonstrated through this law that protecting the environment and economic growth can go hand in hand.
I have the impression the headline about this act, I had, again, reading about it and thinking about it, that it has been a huge and very important success. Again, there seems to be, if not bipartisan support, at least the judgment coming from all sides seems to be that the act itself has been a success. So the question is why? What makes this act so special and that it has been such a success as a policy instrument?
It sets out goals and it sets out deadlines. In 1982, when President Reagan was elected, he, along with the Democratic chairman of our committee, John Dingell from Detroit, and many others, put forward a revision of the Clean Air Law that would eliminate the goals and eliminate the deadlines. And they said, we'll just let the states handle the problem. Well, that would have, in my point of view, defeated the whole purpose of the law. It would have made it impossible to achieve the environmental goals. And we had to fight a very long, hard fight to stop that from happening. But you can imagine the President of the United States and the Democratic chairman of the committee working together to get the votes. They almost had the well, they did have the votes at certain points, but they lost the battle. A lot of people said to me after fighting for 10 years to get a good law in 1990, well, of course you were going to win. It was inevitable. The public supports strong environmental protection. Nothing is inevitable. It could have gone the other way. You have to keep pushing and fighting and arguing, and often against major industries, major political powers that are against progress. They want to pretend that they're for it. They want to say that they really want to protect the environment and public health, but the policies that they advocate won't get us there. And ironically, when you get through the recitation of the achievements by a conservative, a lot of times the conservatives now praise the Clean Air Act, even though a lot of them fought it, but they now argue, since we've achieved so much, why are we getting this effort to move forward and do more? We've done enough. They didn't want us to do what we did in the beginning, and now they say it's enough. We've succeeded. Well, I think it's an indication that we can be successful. The economy can grow. It's not a question of jobs or protection of the environment. It's a question of doing both, and that's what the Clean Air illustrates. The Clean Air Act illustrates we achieved economic gains, we achieved health gains, we achieved environmental gains.
One question that is certainly very much on the mind of our audience is the way the Act has also forced the EPA to use evidence to actually start making regulations. And so, again, what's the story behind this?
Well, and I would add, I think that's a great point, and it's another reason that the Act has been so successful is the inherent flexibility built into it. I mean, I just as an observer of how the provisions that clean up cars and trucks have played out, it's clear in 1990 we needed to do more to reduce pollution. And you had an auto industry that I know, I wasn't there, but I know from stories that they fought very hard against very tough standards. So the Act contemplated one round in which there'd be progress, but it wouldn't be a landmark. It would be a number, numerical targets set by Congress that the auto industry could agree to. And then it said, you can only go further if the pollution reductions are necessary and they're technologically achievable. And the industry may have thought, well, that'll make sure that nothing unreasonable happens. Well, the story of that has been that we have seen successive strengthening of the law over time. And that grant of authority and discretion to the Environmental Protection Agency to really dig into what is the numbers, what do we need the pollution reductions, can it be achieved cost effectively, has been just a tremendous success. And if Congress had left it all just in Congress setting the specific numbers, negotiated with the auto industry, we would never have seen the 90% reduction in pollution from cars and trucks that we've realized.
Is the evidence produced essentially within the bureaucracy, or is this, you have the needed evidence is also produced elsewhere? Is there ways for, it's a major preoccupation here, a connection between academic research and the standards and regulations?
They use a variety of approaches, but the agency will create technical support documents that they'll put out for comment. They will, and that essentially allows them to go to anyone that has information, whether it's industry themselves or academic institutions, to provide information to justify their actions and to back up their actions. So they're very much in a collaborative approach. And as I mentioned with the vehicle standard specifically, the auto industry has been really very, very supportive of the approach, typically not suing the agency. And the reason is because they have this ability to go back and forth, show them data. You get a little bit of sometimes you get a competitive atmosphere where, particularly California is the one state that can go further than the federal standard. You'll have one automaker be able to go to California and say, here's some data that shows we can do more than some of the other companies might be saying, because they see a market advantage in making that case. And that ends up creating a stronger California standard, which ends up justifying a stronger national standard.
It all has to be based on evidence. It has to be based on science every step of the way. The EPA will set the standards based on protecting public health. Well, that will involve a lot of input of what amount of pollutants should we allow people to be exposed to before it causes harm? So they set the standard, not what is now, but what we need to achieve. And then states are given enough time to achieve it, and they can develop a number of ways to do it. For example, the reason California was ahead of the rest of the country is we had the worst. Now, Los Angeles has the worst smog problem in the nation. And so you could clean it up. You could say no more cars can travel in LA. Well, that just wasn't doable. But we could say, do an inventory of all the sources of pollution. Obviously, the major source was from the motor vehicles. But there are a lot of industry sources of pollution. And then develop a plan at the local level of how to achieve those reductions in those pollutants to meet the standards that have been set at the federal level, but the flexibility is with the state and the local area to develop the implementation plan. And some would come from automobile cleanup, and some would come from industry cleanup. Industry would cry about these new tighter standards and new requirements, but when they met those new requirements, the efforts to meet them made them far more competitive internationally because they were more efficient in their operations. Same with automobiles. So when the standards are set, both for the achievement of clean air or the standards are set for what they need to do, there's enough time given to the dirtiest air areas to achieve it, but then they have to do more than the areas that are closer to what we call attainment. Those areas don't have to do as much, but they still have to achieve attainment. So it all works together with a federal backup to make sure the job is done, but a lot of flexibility at the local level.
One of the things that impressed me personally in the history of the Clean Air Act is that it is a very good example of regulation being the source of innovation. And as you know well, the common sense says no, we will generate innovation essentially through competition. And here we have a good example where public regulations are actually generating important innovation. The example of the auto industry is very evident. What do you think about that?
Well, both regulation and competition can work to help us accomplish goals. And so when there's a regulatory approach, and they set the standards, and they say you've got to achieve those standards, it isn't that you've already achieved it and we're going to anoint you for doing that and base the standard on what you're doing. It's what you have to do. And we give them time to develop technology. Sometimes it's not even technology that we have available to us, but it drives innovation, drives the development of technology. Well, there's competition that's going on as well, that Greg mentioned, some automobile companies, which show that they could do more. Well, if they can do more, we'd say to the others, why can't you do that as well? And so we try to use competitive forces and regulatory requirements to drive the innovation to reduce pollution.
This is clearly a very important lesson from the Clean Air Act. What should we do next? What's the next step now?
Well, it's climate change, but I'll let Greg talk about that.
Well, the Clean Air Act as last amended in 1990 has been amazingly adaptive in dealing with climate change. It wasn't originally sort of drafted with that being the principal concern, but we've seen the automobile provisions I discussed have moved on from regulating NOx, or I mean they continue to do that, but have shifted focus to saying, well, we should reduce greenhouse gas emissions as well from automobiles, and that's resulting in tremendous reductions in emissions. We see the president has just announced or finalized the Clean Power Plan, which will reduce greenhouse gas emissions from the power sector by more than 30% by 2030, using a provision under the Clean Air Act that has been used to address conventional pollution over the years. So those are important. Those don't take us as far as we need to go, and so we could imagine additional regulation under the Clean Air Act to further reduce greenhouse gases, and I think that'll be a question before the next administration. We could also see Congress deciding that this is coming to their senses essentially on climate change and wanting to get engaged and pass a law to act.
So what will be what has most impressed you in the story of the Clean Air Act? What will be the lesson for our audience?
I think the first lesson is that you have to look at the evidence, you have to look at the science, you have to involve academics, not just people in the government, ask them to reach out. When they adopt a regulation, it's not haphazard. They have to stand up in court and justify that regulation, because those who are going to challenge it are going to say that it's arbitrary, it's capricious. Well, the EPA has to say, no, this is the basis for it. These were the studies we relied on. This is what we looked at. So you need a strong law that sets out a push for the future, not just accepting where you are, but insisting that we have to advance. And advancement can be through regulation or the government setting in place the competition. When we try to adopt a law dealing with climate change in 2009, we tried to develop a cap and trade industry-wide, economy-wide, to reduce all those pollutants that cause greenhouse gases. And we said we'll do a cap and trade, we'll limit the amount of pollution each year, it'll get tighter, but to do it in the least expensive way, we'll let industries trade with each other. If it's harder to reduce pollution in one area, they can buy the pollution reductions in other areas where it's a lot cheaper to achieve those reductions. We did that for the acid rain issue, and it was a great success. We tried to do it for the climate change problem as well, but we couldn't get it passed. And there we wanted to do it with more market forces, a tax, for example, on carbon, a price on carbon. There's a price that's paid, but you've got to have that price part of what's going on in the process. For example, if you use coal to develop electricity, you can look at the price of coal, which is pretty cheap, so it's less expensive for a utility to burn coal than to do other things. But on the other hand, the pollution from coal has a real economic cost for the community and the planet, and that's called external costs. Well, you've got to try to bring in some of those external costs and not just say that you can pollute for free, or you can pollute without taking into consideration the cost of that. So if you put a cost on those pollutants, you drive the economy forward and the market to achieve those goals.
Yeah, so the Clean Air Act is clearly part of your legacy, but is there things that you think we have not been able to achieve through the Act? Is there limitations to the achievements of the Act? Is there things that we could have done better?
I think the law has been the most effective environmental law that's ever been adopted by the Congress. And in terms of cleaning up the polluted areas of the country, it's been a great success. In terms of reducing toxic pollution, it's an ongoing challenge, but it took an area that was unregulated and people were unprotected and started putting in place a way to stop that pollutant from being so freely put into the air with people living particularly around some of the industrial facilities. The upper ozone was a problem, and it was due to certain chemicals that were used. And now with the Montreal Protocol, we made it an international agreement, as well as our own domestic part of the Clean Air Act. So here we work closely together with other countries to achieve what we need to do here, but to get them to achieve what they needed to do as well. And acid rain was a cap and trade. But the unfinished job and the most serious environmental threat is climate change. And we're already seeing the impact of all these greenhouse gases in the air. They don't dissipate. You put them in the air, they stay there. And if you add more, more is added. And there can be a point not too long from now where when you start doing things to reduce the pollution, it's going to be too late. That the climate will move on its own for the rising of the oceans and all the consequences of it. So we need to avert that. But at the same time, we have to mitigate some of the disaster that's now happening. Storms, heat waves, new diseases, new problems. We have to deal with that. There are islands in the world that are about to go underwater. So I think the international community has to help those people. But at the same time, stop adding more greenhouse gases so that we can hope that we can control the problem before it gets away from us.
You mentioned cap and trade, and so it will be interesting, I think, for the audience to have a better sense of, because I think you could say it has been a very successful experiment, isn't it?
It has been. The 1990 Act set up a cap and trade program for sulfur and NOx from power plants in the eastern half of the United States. And those emissions have been cut dramatically. I think sulfur's been cut by almost 3/4 in that time frame. At the same time,
at a fraction of the cost that we were told it would be if
Absolutely.
we had those reductions to be achieved.
that's a very important point. And so cap and trade is a difficult to explain policy, which makes it politically challenging, but it's one that has proven very effective. And the regulated community has accepted it. They understand that it works, that it's flexible, it's market-based, they like it. And so cap and trade really is a promising area with regard to the Clean Power Plan that was just finalized. We now know that there are many states working together to say, hey, let's work together so we can have tradable emissions. We can do our own. It won't be.
California, for instance, has created
California.
a market for greenhouse gases.
But in the Northeast,
In the Northeast, now other states as well. You're getting surprising red states where there's a political response from at the governor's level saying we don't like to be regulated by EPA, but just below that level you have the technicians, bureaucrats, regulators working together to say, how can we make this work? This is not going to be a showstopper for us. We can make this work. And that's happening. And I think we're going to be getting a lot of good news about states working together to create tradable solutions for greenhouse gases.
and the president's power plant rule does that because one of the major sources of these greenhouse gases comes out of the energy area, electricity area, and President Obama has proposed a regulation telling the states you have to achieve a certain amount of reductions. You have a lot of flexibility to do that. It's not taking an individual plant and saying you have to put a retrofit on and stop the pollution from that plant, but saying you can do a lot of different things in order to achieve the result, and it'll be a lot less expensive if you take into consideration more efficient use of energy, as well as burning more renewable fuels, solar and wind power instead of coal, and pushing the whole system in a direction, but not dictating the terms of everything that has to be done.
So I don't want to rain on the parrot, but the political context at this moment in the United States seems to be particularly propitious for new, bold initiative. I'm not seeing a new Clean Air Act in the next few months or years, and it will be interesting also to better understand where this opposition comes from.
It's hard to know. I think a lot of it's generated by the interest groups. The Koch brothers are major funders of Republicans who deny climate change and want no regulation to deal with it. Of course, that serves their economic interest. They're in the business of producing a lot of the sources of this pollution. So that's one of the forces on the Republican side. But there's also something going on that's hard for me to understand. There's a denial of science. I always grew up with the idea that science was not Democratic or Republican. It was a process of looking at evidence and testing a hypothesis and seeing what fit and revising your thinking as you look at evidence. Well, Republicans have come to the point where they say, science, well, that's just another political opinion. Those scientists have a liberal bias. So they've talked themselves into that. And it shows up when they talk about, for example, they're against abortion, and they're even against family planning. So that when George W. Bush was in power, they tried to put on the website of the Department of Health and Human Services a warning: a woman who gets an abortion is never going to be able to have a child again. Well, there's no evidence of such a statement. It's not scientifically backed by real-world experience, yet they want to put these fears out there. And the same thing on the climate change. They want to tell people, you don't have to worry about it. It's not something you need to worry about. It's made up by the liberals. Well, that's very disturbing to see that kind of approach to science. So I don't know. I can't fully understand it, but if you ask people about climate change, rather than people say, oh, we're worried about it, Democrats will say they're worried about it. Republicans will say, I'm not worried. It doesn't exist. It's all a myth. That doesn't make sense, that people should look at scientific and issues that are so threatening based on their political party affiliation. But the Republicans have led a lot of people to want to stay with their party and figure their leaders know what they're talking about when they don't.
I think, Congress has become remarkably unambitious in its policies, but that doesn't mean there's not great things happening. And they're happening at the state level. California recently adopted a law so that 1/2 of all of their electricity will be from renewable sources. We've seen the northeastern states just double the goal or double the price of that they're putting on carbon dioxide from power plants. We're seeing the solar panel providers are expanding at a dramatic rate. There was just a report, and I believe it was something like 1 out of every 85 jobs that was created in the last year was for solar panel installers. I mean, this is going gangbusters. And so you have these real life technology breakthroughs. You have state innovation, which is fostering them, and you still have an executive branch that wants to act. So their Clean Power Plan that has like a 74% approval rating among the public. People love it, and so even though Congress, I agree with you, Congress is not on the verge of doing anything ambitious, but you have an empowered Environmental Protection Agency. You have businesses that have a financial stake and the economic wherewithal to make good things happen, and you have state leadership, and all those things together, I think, promise action and progress in the future.
An important skill when you're in public health is the capacity to build coalition. So you just allude to this. So you have the impression it is still possible to build a coalition outside and partly inside the institutions in support of a renewal of the philosophy of the Clean Air Act.
I think it's happening. I think if you look at all the actions that came out during Paris, private sector announcements in support of pricing carbon, even oil companies saying they would like to have a carbon tax put on them. Now, granted, these were European oil companies, not American oil companies, but I think that's still an interesting development. You have there's a real change, and it's positive. So. I agree. All those political forces are there, and they're hammering away in an unhelpful way in Congress. But there are forces that are moving us in a positive direction, and I think they'll ultimately prevail.
Congressman Waxman, the same thing. You have the impression there was a coalition outside.
Well, we need it, and it's developing. And in fact, when we introduced the Cap and Trade Bill in 2009, it was based on an industry proposal. There was a group called the Climate Action Partnership. It was made up of the CEOs of some of the major corporations, as well as the environmental groups. And they looked at the issue, and they accepted there was a problem, and developed a system where we could achieve the reductions at the least expensive cost, and it would produce more American industry developments. And imagine if we could develop a way to use coal, which is ubiquitous around the world, without polluting the planet and causing all the other environmental problems. What if we could develop that technology? We'd be selling it around the world. Instead, we're letting other countries take the leadership where we should be out front. Now, I say that criticism, but also the understanding that we're doing a lot of important advances in this country. And it's not coming from the Congress in giving direction. It's coming from the business community, which used to be the backbone of the Republican Party. That Republicans used to be the party of business. But they didn't care what their business people were saying. They were more attuned to the ideologues who just wanted to deny climate change. Well, my experience is things don't happen quickly. You have to use a period of time for people to get comfortable and understand and develop a consensus. And the consensus isn't always by congressmen talking to each other. It's by the public being educated, by the industry saying it's important for our economic development for us to be moving forward with solar energy and wind energy and alternatives. We shouldn't just put all of our eggs in the basket of the highest polluting fossil fuels. And it's important for our automobile industry to achieve those reductions as well. So I think there's a lot of ferment going on, which is very helpful, but there's also a very strong pushback, which is worse than we've ever had in the past, because they're denying science, they're denying what's going on, reality of the impact on people and the climate. And it's a drag, but I think eventually, with the Paris Agreement, the United States, the congressman said, we don't want to do anything, because why should we do something unless the rest of the world's doing it? So we won't act unless they act. And the other countries are saying, well, why should we act if the United States is not acting? This is not a sign of maturity. It's a sign of cutting off your nose to spite your face. But with the agreement that we now have in Paris, all the countries are going to take responsibility, work together, and they don't have that excuse anymore that we're doing alone. Everybody's going to be achieving those reductions. And I think it's going to help American businesses if we're out front in developing the technology to get those reductions of emissions that are threatening everybody on the planet.
Excellent. In conclusion, what I would like, Congressman, is that you give our public health audience advice on, what to do next.
Well, climate change is an environmental threat. And people say, well, it's going to change the world we live in because of droughts and storms and things like that. But it's primarily a public health threat. Diseases that we never envisioned in places like Texas and Florida, because they were diseases further south in Latin America, are now coming up higher and higher and affecting people here in the United States. And a heat wave might be damaging to the environment, but it is terrible for all the people that die when heat waves occur, as well as what we see from these storms. And it's having multifaceted dangers to the people that live on our planet and their ability to live there. Even in the Middle East, with the terrible things that have been going on in Syria, a lot of observers have tried to argue that the drought in Syria caused the civil war to erupt the way it has now, completely out of control, hopefully to be contained soon, but the terrible loss of lives. So it is an important public health issue, and it really affects life on our planet internationally, domestically, and we can't ignore it.
Thank you so very much for your participation. Thank you, Greg. Thank you, Congressman.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.